I was driving through the desolate back roads of the countryside, trying to make it to my family's cabin before nightfall. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the fields and trees. As I drove further into the wilderness, I noticed that the road was becoming more and more rugged. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no other cars in sight. The road turned into a narrow dirt path, and I had to slow down to avoid hitting any potholes. I felt a sense of unease wash over me, but I tried to push it aside and focus on getting to the cabin. That's when I saw a figure in the distance, standing in the middle of the road. As I got closer, I could see that it was a man, dressed in dirty overalls and a ripped flannel shirt. He had a wild look in his eyes, and I could see that he was holding a shotgun. I slammed on the brakes, and the man started walking towards my car. I tried to back up, but the tires spun in the loose gravel. The man got closer, his shotgun pointed directly at me. My heart was pounding, and I thought I was going to die. But then, I noticed something odd about the man's face. It was covered in soot and dirt, but underneath, I could see that he had severe burns. He was missing fingers on one hand, and his skin was pockmarked with scars. I quickly realized that this man had been the victim of a terrible accident, and he was probably living in the wilderness, away from society. I rolled down my window and tried to reason with him, telling him that I meant him no harm. After what felt like hours, the man finally lowered his shotgun and stepped aside. I breathed a sigh of relief and drove away as fast as I could. I finally made it to the cabin, shaken but alive. That experience taught me that even in the middle of nowhere, there are still people living on the fringes of society, struggling to survive. And sometimes, you can find yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was driving down a deserted stretch of road in the middle of nowhere, the only car for miles around. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the barren landscape. I had been on the road for hours, and I was starting to feel a bit uneasy. As I drove, I saw a figure in the distance. It was a man, waving his arms frantically. I slowed down, my heart racing. What was he doing out here all alone? Was he in trouble? As I got closer, I realized that the man was covered in blood. His clothes were torn, and he looked like he had been in a fight. I pulled over, my heart pounding in my chest. He stumbled towards me, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "Please help me," he gasped. "They're after me." I didn't hesitate. I unlocked the doors and motioned for him to get in. As he climbed into the passenger seat, I could smell the metallic tang of blood. He was bleeding badly, and I knew I had to get him to a hospital. As we drove away, he told me his story. He had been hiking in the nearby mountains when he stumbled upon a group of men who were up to no good. They had attacked him, and he had barely managed to escape with his life. We drove for what seemed like hours, with the man growing weaker by the minute. Finally, we came across a small hospital in a nearby town. I rushed him inside, and the doctors immediately went to work on him. As I sat in the waiting room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Who were those men, and why had they attacked the man? Was I in danger too? After what seemed like an eternity, the doctors came out to tell me that the man was going to be okay. He had lost a lot of blood, but they had managed to save him. I breathed a sigh of relief and went back to my car. But as I turned the key in the ignition, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the windshield of my car was a note, written in bold, black letters, "You shouldn't have gotten involved." I had always loved exploring the great outdoors, and when my friend invited me on a camping trip in the middle of nowhere, I jumped at the chance. We packed our gear and drove out to a remote campsite deep in the woods. The first few days were idyllic. We hiked, fished, and cooked over an open fire. But on the fourth night, things took a dark turn. We were sitting around the campfire, chatting and laughing, when we heard a blood-curdling scream in the distance. My friend and I froze, listening intently. It was too far away to tell where it came from, but it sounded human. We were unnerved, but decided it was probably just someone letting off steam in the middle of nowhere. But the next night, we heard the scream again. And the night after that. Each time, it sounded closer and more urgent. We began to feel like we were being watched, and the hairs on the back of our necks stood up every time we heard the scream. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, or someone playing a prank on us. But deep down, we knew something wasn't right. On the fifth night, we were sitting by the fire when we heard the scream again, louder than ever before. And then, we heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the leaves and branches. We both jumped up, adrenaline pumping through our veins. We shone our flashlights into the darkness, but couldn't see anything. The footsteps grew louder, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. That's when we saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, shrouded in darkness. It was tall and imposing, with a long, flowing cape. We couldn't make out any facial features, but we could sense its malevolent energy. My friend and I ran for our lives, scrambling through the woods in the dead of night. We eventually made it back to our car, panting and sweating. We peeled out of the campsite, not looking back until we were miles away. To this day, we have no idea what we saw or heard that night. But we both know we'll never go camping in the middle of nowhere again. I had always been fascinated with the idea of being completely alone in the wilderness. So, when I decided to go on a solo camping trip, I was excited to finally experience it. I packed my gear and set out on the long drive to the remote campsite I had chosen. The sun was setting when I arrived, and I quickly set up my tent and started a small fire. I ate my dinner and settled in for the night, feeling at peace in the quiet of the wilderness. But as the night wore on, I heard strange noises outside my tent. At first, I assumed it was just the wind or animals, but the noises grew louder and more persistent. It sounded like footsteps circling my tent, and I could hear heavy breathing. My heart racing, I cautiously unzipped the tent flap and peered out into the darkness. But there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the noises continued throughout the night, leaving me feeling uneasy and sleepless. The next morning, I decided to hike around the area and explore. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed strange symbols carved into the trees and rocks. They were intricate and unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the sun began to set, I headed back to my campsite, only to find that it had been ransacked. My tent was torn, my gear was scattered, and my food was gone. Panic set in, and I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed what I could salvage and started walking back to my car. But as I made my way through the woods, I could hear footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I quickened my pace, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The footsteps followed, getting louder and more insistent. I could feel someone breathing down my neck, but every time I turned around, no one was there. Finally, I burst out of the woods and saw my car parked in the distance. I sprinted towards it, heart racing, and jumped inside. I peeled out of the campsite, not looking back until I was miles away. To this day, I don't know what or who was stalking me in the woods that night. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never go camping alone again. I had been driving for hours, the sun setting on the horizon as I made my way deeper into the rural countryside. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere and now found myself on a dusty, deserted road with nothing but miles of barren farmland on either side of me. As I drove on, I began to feel a sense of unease. The road seemed to go on forever, and there was no sign of life in any direction. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the darkness was starting to creep in around me. Just as I was about to turn around and head back the way I came, I saw a figure up ahead on the road. As I got closer, I could see it was a man, standing in the middle of the road, waving his arms frantically. I slowed down and rolled down my window, asking if he needed help. But as soon as I did, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The man's eyes were wild and his clothes were torn, as if he had been running through the fields. He stumbled towards me, mumbling something incoherent. I tried to ask him again if he needed help, but he just kept repeating the same phrase over and over again, "Don't go any further. You won't make it out alive." My heart pounding in my chest, I hit the gas and drove past him, not stopping until I was far enough away that I couldn't see him in my rearview mirror. But the sense of unease only grew stronger as I drove on. The road seemed to go on forever, and there was no sign of civilization in sight. Just as I was about to give up hope and resign myself to spending the night in my car, I saw the glow of lights in the distance. As I got closer, I could see it was a small town, nestled in a valley between the hills. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the memory of the man on the road stayed with me. I never found out who he was or why he was there, but I knew one thing for sure: I never wanted to be caught in the middle of nowhere like that again. I was on a road trip with my friends, driving through a remote part of the country. It was getting late, and we were having trouble finding a place to stay for the night. We were running low on gas and our cell phones had no signal. The road was deserted, and we hadn't seen another car for miles. Just when we were starting to panic, we saw a sign for a motel up ahead. We pulled into the parking lot, relieved to have found somewhere to spend the night. The motel was run down and creepy, but we didn't care as long as we had a roof over our heads. The motel owner greeted us with a toothless grin and showed us to our room. As soon as we walked in, I could feel that something was off. The room was freezing cold, and the air smelled musty and stale. The bed linens were stained and the walls were peeling. We decided to suck it up and stay for the night since we had no other options. But as soon as we settled in, strange things started to happen. The lights flickered on and off, and we heard eerie noises coming from the walls. I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. As the night wore on, our fear grew. We tried to stay calm, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We heard footsteps outside our door, but when we checked, there was no one there. Finally, morning came, and we hastily packed our bags and left. As we drove away, I noticed something odd in the rearview mirror. There was a man standing outside the motel, watching us leave. His face was contorted into a sinister grin, and I knew then that we had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. We never spoke about that night again, but I will never forget the terror I felt being stranded in that creepy motel in the middle of nowhere. I was on a road trip with my friends, driving through the remote countryside. The sun had set hours ago, and we were driving on a narrow, winding road with no street lights. The darkness outside was absolute, except for the weak beams of our car headlights. We had been driving for hours and hadn't seen any other cars or signs of civilization. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I began to feel uneasy, as if we were the only ones left in the world. As we turned a corner, we saw something up ahead in the distance. It was a small, dilapidated gas station, with flickering neon lights and a closed sign on the door. We decided to pull over and check it out, hoping to at least find some snacks and drinks. As we approached the station, I noticed something strange. There were no cars parked outside, and the windows were boarded up. It looked abandoned, but the neon lights were still on. We shrugged it off and walked inside. The interior was dimly lit, and the shelves were empty except for a few dusty cans of food. The cash register was open, but there was no money inside. It looked like the owner had closed up shop and left in a hurry. Suddenly, we heard a noise outside. It was a faint rustling sound, like someone was walking around. We cautiously walked out, but there was no one there. We scanned the darkness, but there was nothing but the sound of the wind. We got back in the car, and as we were pulling away, we saw something in the rearview mirror. It was a figure, standing in the shadows outside the gas station. We couldn't make out any features, but it was watching us. We sped away, feeling a sense of dread wash over us. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached a town with people and lights. We never spoke about the incident again, but we all knew that we had encountered something otherworldly in that desolate gas station in the middle of nowhere. I had always been an outdoorsy type, so when my friends invited me on a camping trip deep in the forest, I jumped at the chance. We packed our bags and headed out early in the morning, excited for the adventure ahead. The first few days were perfect. We hiked through the woods, set up camp by a tranquil stream, and cooked meals over an open fire. But on the third night, something changed. We heard strange noises in the distance, rustling in the bushes, and the feeling of being watched. At first, we brushed it off as just our imagination, but the unease grew stronger with each passing minute. The air felt heavy, and we could sense a malevolent presence lurking in the shadows. We huddled together in our tents, hoping the feeling would pass. But then, we heard footsteps approaching our campsite. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming closer and closer. We held our breath, too terrified to move. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, carrying a large hunting knife. He didn't say a word, just stood there staring at us with a look of hatred in his eyes. We were frozen, trapped in the middle of nowhere with no one to turn to for help. We knew we had to do something, so we slowly began to back away, hoping he wouldn't follow us. But he did. He chased us through the woods, his footsteps pounding against the ground. We ran for what felt like hours, our hearts pounding in our chests. Finally, we stumbled upon a ranger station and were able to call for help. The man was eventually caught, and it turned out he had been living in the woods for years, surviving off the land and preying on unsuspecting campers. It was a close call, and it still haunts me to this day. I've never gone camping again, and I always make sure to stay in well-populated areas when I'm in the wilderness. I was driving through the countryside, trying to find a shortcut to my destination. It was a beautiful day, with blue skies and rolling hills as far as the eye could see. But as I drove further into the heart of nowhere, I began to feel uneasy. The road became narrower and more winding, and the landscape grew desolate. There were no signs of civilization, no gas stations, no convenience stores, nothing but fields and forests stretching for miles. My gas tank was running low, and I realized I had made a mistake by taking this route. I checked my phone for a signal, but there was none. I was completely cut off from the rest of the world. As I drove, I saw a figure in the distance. It was a man, walking along the side of the road. I pulled over and rolled down my window, hoping he could give me some directions. But as he approached my car, I could see something was off about him. He had a wild look in his eyes and was muttering to himself. I quickly rolled up my window and locked the doors. But he wasn't deterred. He pounded on the glass, screaming at me to let him in. I hit the gas and sped away as fast as I could. The man ran after me at first before running off the road and disappearing into the woods. I was terrified, but I refused to stop. I drove for what felt like hours, my heart racing with fear. Finally, I saw a small town in the distance. I pulled into a gas station, grateful to be alive. As I filled up my tank, I asked the attendant about the man I had seen on the road. He told me a chilling story about a mental patient who had escaped from a nearby hospital. He had been on the loose for weeks, and no one knew where he was. I shuddered at the thought of what could have happened if I had let that man into my car. I realized then that being in the middle of nowhere can be a dangerous place, and it's always best to stay alert and aware of your surroundings. I was on a road trip through the countryside, enjoying the peaceful scenery of rolling hills and farmland. But as the sun began to set, I realized I was lost. My GPS had lost signal, and I had no idea where I was. I kept driving, hoping to come across a town or gas station. But the road I was on grew more desolate, and the houses became farther and farther apart. Soon, I was driving through nothing but fields and woods. As night fell, my anxiety grew. I had no phone signal, no map, and no idea how to get back to civilization. I began to wonder if I would ever make it out of this lonely road. That's when I saw the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I was relieved to see another car. But as it got closer, I realized something was off. The car was old, rusted, and had no license plate. It was driving dangerously close behind me, almost like it was trying to run me off the road. I tried to speed up and lose the car, but it stayed right behind me. I began to panic, my heart racing with fear. I didn't know who was driving that car or what they wanted from me. Suddenly, the car pulled up alongside me, and I saw the driver for the first time. He was a scruffy-looking man with wild hair and an unkempt beard. He was staring at me with a look of pure malice in his eyes. I swerved to avoid him, but he kept following me. I was sure he was going to run me off the road or worse. But then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned off the road and disappeared into the night. I finally made it back to civilization, shaken but alive. I never found out who that driver was or what he wanted from me, but I know that I'll never forget the terror I felt on that lonely road in the middle of nowhere.